Hi, I'm Lindsey Moore, and I'm a South Carolina realtor with a passion for preservation. Welcome to My Old Carolina Home. My Old Carolina Home is a video series dedicated to preserving the heritage and homes of our amazing state. As our communities grow and change, we want to help pass these sacred stories down to the next generation to help create a sense of cultural continuity and to help preserve the key characteristics that make our Carolina places so unique. Today, we're at Ainsley Hall in beautiful Columbia, South Carolina. This residence is the only one in South Carolina that we have actual documented proof to be designed by Robert Mills. That's why we call it the Robert Mills House. Robert Mills was America's first professional architect, and he was a South Carolina native son. He designed the Washington Monument and many other important federal buildings. Today, we're going to investigate the possibility that there's another Robert Mills designed home in South Carolina. Join us as we head to Newberry to meet with architect and Robert Mills historian Dewey Ervin to examine the evidence. He'll help us investigate all the clues and see if we think the house in Newberry, the Frederick Nance house at Oak Grove, was also a Robert Mills design. Ready to take a little road trip? Let's go. So here we are at the Oak Grove Plantation, and we're going to just kind of take a look inside. So tell us anything you notice about the outside that just kind of speaks to our Robert Mills connection.
Yeah. Great neoclassical building. It's had subsequent renovations, all of which I believe were from the 19th century. There might have been some 20th century renovations, certainly the porch with the broken tile is a mid-20th century renovation. The columns, heavy Greek revival. Possibly 20th century restoration work. I would have thought the original 1820s columns might have been more simple, but by the 1850s you had renovations that really exhibited the wealth of the owners, and a lot of the trim stuff would exhibit that style of later Greek revival style than the neoclassical.
But we kind of think the essential form is still intact, and then they've just had to replace bits and pieces throughout the years and throughout the generations to maintain it.
So the main massing of the brick structure is 1820s, that federal period, and even the proportions of the windows, the door, which is a restoration of what would have been here in 1820, all speak to that federal style, proportions, that Adamesque neoclassical style, which would be 1822 to 1825. The door itself is replicates that period of a door. The fan lights, all this was handmade to replace a Victorian door that was here. And so the current owners really went above and beyond to be respectful of the original structure with the style and the craftsmanship that they came back with. And so you have this beautiful fan light with this neoclassical composition here.
Dewey, let's look just a minute at the bricks, because I think we can still see some evidence of sort of the Robert Mills handprint here on the house. What is this, these little lines that we see?
So a trick that Robert Mills did in certainly a lot of his public buildings, and you can see this in Columbia in the Ainsley Hall house, you have your brickwork, but oftentimes to sort of formalize this brickwork, they would come back with a red dusty paint and then pencil mortar joints. And you can see this right here in this sort of lime penciling that they did at the mortar joints to just further accentuate the mortar joints and the pattern of the brickwork. And then oftentimes they would even superimpose this penciling to suggest a different bond pattern like Flemish bond or regular bond to hide what would have been a much more irregular bond pattern. And so that was a way to sort of overlay the work of the mason with something a lot more rigid and refined. And
that is fascinating.
So you still can see this throughout the house, and I think that is an incredible relic. They call it penciling, and Robert Mills refers to penciling in a lot of his public projects.
Okay, let's go inside and take a look. So here we are in the center hall of the Oak Grove Mansion, and let's talk a little bit about the floor plan and how this is similar to other of Mills' residential designs and kind of how this is reflective of the age.
Sure. Typical early 19th century building with a center hall and two large rooms on either side. This floor, the principal floor, was meant to be a public place where they would entertain company and guests, and oftentimes they'd have a principal bedroom in one of these rooms. Boy, these ceiling heights, just a great example of that time period where you had these real beautiful tall ceilings and great trim work throughout. There have been substantial renovations in the later 19th century, but all nonetheless 19th century work. Robert Mills typically did not celebrate a monumental stair would have been something that was added later. He typically, as with Thomas Jefferson, would hide staircases as a purely utilitarian feature. And this house really exhibits that that was the case originally. So a subsequent generation would have added this very grand, beautiful, substantial staircase, which was very well done, but again would have shown a later renovation.
That makes perfect sense.
Sure.
That it was, the grandson of Frederick Nance who probably came through and made this addition.
That's right.
Okay, let's check out the dining room. So a couple of things that we might like to kind of show our viewers in here, this is where you can really see the forms of the windows and those interior shutters. That is considered to be a Robert Mills signature, is that correct?
That's right. The few residential projects that are known to have been done by Robert Mills include that feature, that is internal shutters, that also are very a feature of the early 19th century.
So this mantle in the dining room may potentially be from the era in which they were trying to restore the 1820s period of the house. How does this mantle kind of fit in with that Adamesque style?
Sure. So in the 1820s, as we were talking about, the Federal style or the Adam style architecture has everything to do with very refined, very thin and almost flat type of details. And this mantelpiece, which may be a later addition, nonetheless really references that earlier style of architecture with the fine detailing on the pillars on either side, which is very much a neoclassical Adamesque style or Federal style as they called it in the United States, as well as the middle panel there with the classical scene and all the other details. The reading, all these fine details are very much a reference to the early neoclassical style of Adam or Federal architecture.
It certainly is beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. So similarly, the medallion, the center medallion and the ceiling here is very much of that style. It's very much a neoclassical Adamesque or Federal style, which references, again, the archaeology of the early 19th century, where they were discovering the ruins of Pompeii and seeing a very delicate type of classicism. And so you see that in these very delicate scalloping of that medallion, the fine reading of the leaves and wreaths that are up there, very much in keeping with the mantelpiece. And so these two they play off each other very well.
It looks like icing on a wedding cake.
That's right. So detailed and fine.
So here we are in the drawing room, and let's just talk a little bit about how this room is so different from the dining room, and that we think, this one may have been from that 1850s period in some of its detail.
Sure. Again, you have these two different versions of neoclassicism. You have the Adam style, which was in the 1820s, and the Federal period, we call it in the United States, that really talks about refined proportions and very thin lines and a lot more flat decoration. By the 1850s, a couple of generations later, the grandson of the builder of this house came back with what was in vogue at that time, which was another style of neoclassicism called Greek Revival. A little heavier implementation of Greek style, Greek proportions, Greek profiles. And I would say the cornice, for instance, in this room is a little heavier and speaks to that later 19th century renovation.
Yeah, you really can just sense the weight of it compared to the delicateness of what's in the dining room.
The current owners did a wonderful job of recreating that style in this mantelpiece. The original mantelpieces, which were more subtle, are in the attic of the house, actually, so, which is really great. All that material is still on site. This beautifully hand-carved mantle really exhibits that Greek Revival period, the later 19th century renovation.
They really spared no expense in giving this house its day. So Dewey and I are here in the kitchen, and we're going to talk a little bit about a very interesting artifact that he's brought with us. This is a reproduction of the Mills Atlas. And what do we see here on this map?
So when Mills was back in South Carolina in the 1820s, working with the state on the improvement of the state infrastructure, roadways, waterways, the means of taking product to market, he did a private venture of a state atlas of all the counties and districts in the state. So Mills Atlas of South Carolina. He did a companion volume with this atlas called The Statistics of South Carolina, in which he went county by county and described what he saw. This particular map of Newberry district really is one of the clues that connects this house to the architect Robert Mills. Mills generated this map from a copper plate engraving, improved those, updated them with new roads, but also, interestingly, houses and structures. And so on the map for Newberry County, for example, the town of Newberry appears, but also dots that indicate property owners around the county. And just outside of the town of Newberry is the name Nance, a black dot that says Nance on it. Now, Mills used another existing survey from 1820 of Newberry County that did not have that on there. So that was an addition by Robert Mills himself. So this 1825 map of Newberry County includes a dot locating the Nance house, but it also acknowledges the earlier 1820 survey. So we really do have this great sort of forensic evidence that this was a house that didn't exist before 1822, but did exist before 1825. So that gives a great window of identifying when the house appears.
So while we're in the kitchen, since we talked a little bit about, we think the grand central stair may have come about in the 1850s, what did we find in here? Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what we discovered here that kind of speaks to some of what may have originally been in the 1820s?
Absolutely. So the house had what was considered a service stair, sort of hidden out of the main hallway and in what is the kitchen today, and would have been a smaller, more cut-up space in the original house. And so the floorboards indicate the current owners at one point did take out that service stair. And you'll notice you've got these wide planks from the original floor and a small series of more recent replacement boards. And those boards replace where the old service stair once was. And if you go to the upper floors, you'll still see that staircase, which exists and takes you to the attic.
And they just line right up. So it was probably on this side, and then that makes perfect sense.
And that also talks to a feature that Mills did in all of his private residences, and that is basically hid the staircase. And that was a trick that he learned from Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
At Monticello, the stair is not a celebrated feature in the house. It's considered utilitarian and tucked out of the way. And so the houses in Columbia that Mills is known to have done, whether the Ainsley Hall house or the DeBrule Marshall house, both of which had hidden staircases or staircases that were put in side rooms and not in the main stair hall. For example, the DeBrule Marshall house in Columbia, this is a photograph of that house in the 1930s. And you'll see this heavy, heavy Victorian stair in the main entry hall. That is known to have been done in the mid-19th century or the 1850s and was a later addition to the house, whereas the historic stair was off of the stair hall and has been restored to that arrangement today. Similarly, this house, we believe, had a renovation in the 1850s where they added a grand stair in the central hall, as was in vogue at the time. I would suggest that this service stair would have been the original stair to the house and would have been, you would have had a clear central hallway open, which would have been more in keeping with other designs by Robert Mills.
And so Mills, when he put together a plan, he really had a lot of forethought about how the building was going to function and kind of where all the utilitarian needs were. Because another interesting thing we find in this house is it actually has closets, which would not have been typical for the 1820s. And so Mills was very forward thinking in the terms of having these, service spaces and those little functional things that, others weren't thinking of during that time.
Absolutely. You have, again, his exposure to architects like James Hoban, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Latrobe talks of a sophistication that just did not exist in otherwise provincial architecture. In these rural, remote areas, people were building just as they would in a vernacular style. I mean, so when Mills shows up, he's bringing with him this whole canon of Western architecture and a sophistication that just was not evident in other buildings in the area. And so that's another reason why a house this substantial really does narrow down the key players to somebody like Robert Mills.
We're here in the library at the Oak Grove House with architect and architectural historian Dewey Ervin. So you've had a chance to walk around the house today. What do you think about its design and construction and this exciting connection?
It's been a lot of fun to hear the story and make the connections. It's definitely a substantial house from the 1820s, early 19th century. And the connection with Robert Mills is, I think, pretty well established with circumstantial evidence as well as other biographical evidence that connects Robert Mills, the architect, with the original builder, Frederick Nance. Just a great story.
So Dr. Bryan has studied this house extensively and has drawn the conclusion that it was designed by Robert Mills. What do you think helped him get there?
Dr. Bryan came to the house in the early 2000s and helped get this house listed on the National Register for Historic Places. In doing that, he was able to establish a connection with the architect Robert Mills, who is considered to be the first professional architect in the United States to have been born in the United States. So that connection is very substantial. Bryan, who wrote the book literally on Robert Mills and taught several seminar courses for many years at the University of South Carolina, he was able to make that connection through looking at the house physically, but also making the biographical connection with all the key players in its construction and in its history. And so the attribution to the architect Robert Mills is pretty sound and very exciting.
That is so cool. So let's talk a little bit about Robert Mills and what was happening in South Carolina in the 1820s and what he kind of came back here to do.
So Robert Mills was born in Charleston in the late 18th century. In his late teens, he began to apprentice with an Irish architect named James Hoban, who lived in Charleston at the time. Hoban was handpicked by George Washington, the first president, to design the executive mansion in the new city of Washington. And so Mills traveled with James Hoban to Washington, D.C., and began working on the White House, what would become known as the White House. While working with Hoban, Thomas Jefferson notices Robert Mills and his potential talent and really takes him under his wing and asks him to come stay with him at Monticello. So all that leads to probably the most unparalleled education for a young Robert Mills to become a trained architect. At Monticello, he has access to the most extensive private library in the country, and certainly the most extensive architectural library. So he begins this early learning period as a young architect, working for Hoban, studying under Jefferson, working on federal buildings in the young city of Washington. He then begins working for the English-born architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe in Philadelphia. All this is a great training for his eventual solo career, where he, in the late teens of the 19th century, he has a national practice where he's doing buildings, public buildings, churches, municipal buildings, federal buildings, up and down the East Coast in the young country. He becomes an architect of great significance in the early 19th century.
So with the influence of Jefferson, America was only 40-ish years old in this period of the 1820s. What was their thought process and why did they love classical architecture so much? And why did that sort of renaissance of Greek and Roman form kind of come to the forefront of what they wanted to see in the United States?
So Mills, when he was studying with Jefferson and all these other architects, the vocabulary of the day was neoclassicism. So you have this style appearing in England and in Europe based on new discoveries in archaeology with Roman ruins, and particularly Pompeii, ignite this interest in neoclassical architecture. And particularly in the 1820s, you get a very delicate style known as the Adams style or the Federal style in America. That specific type of neoclassicism becomes in vogue, very flat, very delicate, that kind of thing. So when you see Jefferson architecture or Robert Mills architecture or Latrobe or Hoban, some of these people that were practicing in the United States, you do see that Adams style, or what we call federal style, in the United States. And it becomes the vocabulary, the architectural vocabulary for public architecture, federal architecture. This interest in connecting these buildings, this architecture, with an older Western monumental architecture. So that language really does announce that this is a important place. We are somebody. We are important. We're sort of showing off the culture and the sophistication that can be found in America at the time.
And how do we see that neoclassical style translated into this house here at Oak Grove specifically?
It is really interesting to see a house of this substantial construction during that period in this location. So fast forward a little bit in Mills's career. By 1820, he is an architect of national importance, national renown. He's done buildings all up and down the East Coast and throughout the country. The state of South Carolina begins looking at the increased economy, the success of different technologies, agricultural technologies and advancements, and as a state begins thinking that they need to improve their infrastructure to accommodate commerce in the state. And so they look to Robert Mills, who at the time had a career of national relevance, and he's a native son of South Carolina. So the state legislature reaches out to this private practitioner and says, will you come back to South Carolina and head the building commission, the state building commission, and oversee some of these internal improvements, whether it's roadways, canals, waterways, but also public buildings. The head of that committee in the state legislature was Frederick Nance. He was a state senator at the time, and he was from Newberry. So he becomes a part of a group that reaches out to Robert Mills directly and engages him to come back to South Carolina and begin this career as a public servant working on public projects in the state.
So we have this definite documented connection between Robert Mills and Frederick Nance. What else do we know about Robert Mills and what he was working on at the time that helps us make this connection?
We've established that the house was definitely built between 1822 and 1825. And for that period, a house of this material and this size was very substantial, certainly for this location as well. It's associated with Frederick Nance, who was a public official that was working with Robert Mills on a professional capacity around the state. That he engaged Robert Mills would have been a natural thing to do. In the 1820s, he oversaw the construction of the Newberry courthouse, and Charles Beck was the builder of the Newberry courthouse, as well as some other buildings in the upstate, but also the Ainsley Hall House in Columbia, South Carolina. The Ainsley Hall House is absolutely connected with Robert Mills through documents and existing records. Beck built that house, but he also is known to have built the Newberry courthouse. The techniques and materials he used for the Newberry courthouse appear in the Frederick Nance house, the house we're in right now, and is a strong connection to say that not only did Robert Mills design the house, but that Charles Beck was the contractor. And all that is also corroborated by Frederick Nance's involvement in these public projects, his connection to both men professionally and through his public office. And all that really speaks to, a strong connection to the architect, the builder, and the original owner. There are subsequent renovations and things that were done to the house by later generations that speak to the family's wealth and things that were in vogue in later generations. But there's still enough evidence of the original structure and the original design that we can tie back to Robert Mills.
So with all the evidence that we have, it's more likely that Robert Mills was involved than that he was not.
That's a good way to put that. Yes, I would say so.
Okay, thank you.
Carolina, I've a kind of longing for you. Carolina, no place finer, city that's true. I have made all preparation going home today. When I get down to the station, to the engineer I'll say, carry me back to my